Hello, dear friends. I am Dr. Rajesh Swarnakar, your host and moderator for the evening, giving you a warm welcome to this innovative ACER of a webinar from Chest Council of India, bringing experts from 4 different specialties on a common platform to discuss a common concern, allergy. Involvement of cross specialty to address a common problem is a brainchild of our dear Dr. Krishna, who is founder, chairman, and trustee of Chest Council of India, which is a unique platform for pulmonologists in India. So the term allergic march, also called as atopic march, refers to the natural history of atopic manifestations, which is characterized by a typical sequence of immunoglobulin E, IgE, antibody responses, and clinical symptoms which may appear early in life, persist over years or decades, and often remit spontaneously with the age. Atopic dermatitis, allergic rhinitis, allergic conjunctivitis, and allergic asthma often affect the same patients and develop in temporal succession. This progression from atopic dermatitis in infancy to allergic rhinitis and asthma in childhood and young adulthood is referred to as the allergic march or atopic march. Nearly 80% of children with atopic dermatitis will subsequently develop allergic rhinitis or asthma later in their life. Essentially, the common trend demonstrated is that the younger an individual is when they are diagnosed with atopic dermatitis and are the most severe or persistent their atopic dermatitis is, the greater the chance they will continue down the atopic march to eventually develop asthma and or allergic rhinitis. So with this context, I am proud to present today's webinar from Chest Council of India on atopic march, concepts and comorbidities. We are very pleased to have very illustrious panel of experts from 4 different specialties for this webinar. And of course, let me introduce you to them. The one is Dr. Nazia Nausheen Siddiqui. She's a very unique specialist that she holds qualification of pulmonology as well as dermatology, but she is practicing dermatologist in area hospital Namapalli, Hyderabad. We can't have a better specialist than her on this webinar. Then we have Dr. Sarika Verma, who's senior ENT surgeon and allergic specialist, who's director of Allergy Doc Clinics, Gurgaon, Haryana. She will be speaking on allergic rhinitis. Then we have Dr. Mrs. Archana Swarnakar, who's MS and DNP in ophthalmology, and she's head department of ophthalmology, Getwell Hospital and Research Institute, Nagpur. And she also happens to be my better half. And we have young Dr. Kumar Utsav from Varanasi, who's a young pulmonologist, and he will be speaking on allergic bronchial asthma. So we have this illustrious panel, and I am sure that they will be giving you their own view of this common problem which affects their specialty, and then we will find a common ground when we do a panel discussion. So for saving time, we will roll out lectures one by one, followed by panel discussion and answering audience questions. So dear viewers, kindly post your queries in question box along with the name of faculty to whom you want to address that query, and we'll try to take as many questions as possible. So let the ball be rolling. So here we begin. Over to you, Dr. Nazia, for your first talk on allergic dermatitis or atopic dermatitis. Thank you.
Hello, uh, good evening, everybody. Today, my topic of presentation is atopic dermatitis. So, what is atopic dermatitis? It's an itchy, chronic, or chronically relapsing inflammatory skin condition that often starts in early childhood, usually before the age of 2 years. The most common chronic inflammatory skin disease of childhood, it is associated with pruritus. Usually starts in infancy, presents with dry skin, eczematous lesions, and lichenification. It is associated with other IgE-associated disorders like allergic rhinitis, asthma, and food allergies, and it has a significant morbidity. Coming to the etiology, it has genetic, environmental, as well as abnormalities in the skin and immune system. Atopic dermatitis is a part of the atopic triad, which has AD, allergic rhinoconjunctivitis, and asthma, which may start simultaneously or in succession in what is known as atopic march. So coming to the etiology, we have genetic factors and also the immune dysregulation of Th2 cells, IgA which is reduced, IgE which is raised. In environmental factors, we have allergens, infections, heat, and cat dander. The other factors are pruritus, sweating, psychological stress, and vascular effects. The genetics. If one parent is atopic, there is more than 50% chance that their offspring will develop atopic symptoms. If both parents are affected, up to 80% of offspring will be affected. The genetics, the filaggrin mutations. Loss of function mutations of filaggrin, that is filament aggregating protein, and epidermal protein that is broken down into natural moisturization factors. Filaggrin mutations are present in up to 30% of AD patients. It may also predispose patients to ichthyosis vulgaris, allergic rhinitis, and keratosis pilaris. The environmental factors. Food hypersensitivity may also cause or exacerbate the AD in 10% to 30% of patients. 90% of such reactions or flares are caused by eggs, milk, peanuts, soy, wheat, and also seafoods. The recent studies indicate that there may be an association between smoking and also adult onset atopic dermatitis. The epidemiology. 10 to 30% it occurs in children, 2 to 10% in adults, in people living in high altitudes and who are less exposed to sun and less of humidity. The subsets of atopic dermatitis are age-based. The first one is the early onset atopic dermatitis from birth to 2 years old. Most common type of atopic dermatitis with approximately 60% of cases starting by the age, by this age and resolved by 12 years of age. The late onset atopic dermatitis symptoms begin after the onset of puberty. The senile onset atopic dermatitis, an unusual subset with onset in patients older than 60 years old. The barrier defects. Defective skin barrier that is susceptible to xerosis and environmental irritants and allergens that lead to inflammation, pruritus, and the classical findings of atopic dermatitis. Decreased levels of ceramides, which are sphingolipids in the stratum corneum, may play a role in skin barrier function and prevent the transepidermal water loss. The inflammatory response. The defective skin barrier allows the irritants and allergens to penetrate the skin and cause inflammation via an overreactive Th2 response with increased IL-4, IL-5, and cytokines. In acute lesions, and Th1 response with interferon gamma and IL-12 in the chronic lesions. Scratching of the skin also stimulates keratinocytes to release inflammatory cytokines such as TNF-alpha, IL-1, and IL-6. The antimicrobial peptides. Decreased antimicrobial peptides like human beta defensins, cathelicidins in the epidermis of atopic patients also contribute to Staphylococcus aureus colonization seen in more than 90% of atopic dermatitis patients. Staphylococcus aureus may worsen the inflammation of atopic dermatitis lesions and lead to secondary infection and impetiginization. In atopic dermatitis, there is a significant water loss across the epidermis. But why there is dysregulation of the epidermal barrier is not totally understood. Filaggrin, which is critical for epithelial integrity, may be dysfunctional in such patients. During history taking, we see the onset and distribution of lesions and severity of pruritus, family history, and presence of any contact allergens and trigger factors like dust, mites, and animal dander, and hot showers also, and some fragrances, hypersensitivities, and synthetic fabrics such as polyester. Coming to the clinical findings. The classical physical examination findings depends on the age groups. For example, in infants, they develop edematous papules and plaques that may become vesicles or crust on the scalp, face, and more on extremities, extensor aspects. The infants rarely have atopic dermatitis lesions affecting the diaper area. This is because of the moisture, but may be susceptible to other causes of diaper dermatitis such as candida or seborrheic dermatitis. In clinical features, we have acute edematous and erythematous papules and plaques and crusting. In subacute, we have erythema, scaling, and variable crusting. In the chronic lesions, they become thickened and lichenification stage starts. AD children classically have less exudative patches and plaques on the antecubital and popliteal foci, whereas in adults, the chronic lichenified enhanced skin markings of lesions that have a predilection for hands. Individual lesions may also be further classified into these, like lichenified skin on the knees and follicular discoid erythemas. And this is the perifollicular prominence seen in AD patients. Coming to the diagnosis, atopic dermatitis is typically a clinical diagnosis given the classical distribution of lesions in each age group. The presence of associated findings, for example, like keratosis pilaris, may facilitate the diagnosis. A biopsy shows an eczematous pattern. In childhood cases that are recalcitrant to treatment, fluorescent enzyme immunoassays or skin prick testing can be performed to detect immunoglobulin E antibodies against specific allergens. This is a pityriasis alba. On the cheeks, we can see hypopigmented, scaly patches in children, and dry discoid eczema on the hands in an atopic dermatitis child. Coming to the major features and other common findings in a atopic child, major features are pruritus, rash on the face, on extensor aspects in infants and young children, lichenification in the flexural areas in older children, and tendency toward chronic or chronically relapsing dermatitis, personal or family history of atopic dermatitis like asthma, allergy, rhinitis, and atopic dermatitis. The other common clinical findings are dryness, a Denny Morgan fold, which is nothing but a line which is seen below the eyes in atopic children, in the lower margin of the lower eyelid. Allergic shiners like darkening beneath the eyes are seen, facial pallor, pityriasis alba, keratosis pilaris, ichthyosis vulgaris, hyperlinearity of the palms and soles, white dermographism like white lines appears on the skin within 1 minute of being stroked with blunt instruments, conjunctivitis, keratoconus, anterior subcapsular cataracts, and elevated serum IgE levels and immediate skin test reactivity. The differential diagnosis is allergic contact dermatitis, lichen simplex, lichen planus, psoriasis, scabies, and tinea infections, and also seborrheic dermatitis. The treatment options. There are 4 components in the treatments like avoidance of the trigger factors and daily skincare, anti-inflammatory therapy, and complementary modalities. Daily skincare includes the application of emollients twice daily with the application within 3 minutes of exiting from a lukewarm shower or bath to prevent any skin drying. The treatment, to prevent the inflammation, secondary infections, and Ig regulation. To prevent the dry skin, elimination of exacerbating factors and prevention of skin irritation, skin care with natural moisturizing factors based emollients, oil baths, petrolatum, sunflower oil, use of syndates, and avoidance of soaps. Anti-inflammatory agents like steroids, topical corticosteroids, and topical immunomodulators, cyclosporin A and mycophenolate mofetil. Ultraviolet therapy is also used in decreasing inflammation. To decrease the secondary bacterial infections or other viral infection, antibiotics, antibiotic glucocorticoid combination, antiviral agents, and sometimes fungal infection also coexist, like with antimycotics and antiseptics. To decrease the IgE, avoidance strategies, environmental control, specific immunotherapy, climate change, high altitude mountains, and seaside residences. Coming to the topical corticosteroids. Ointments are the most occlusive but maybe more greasy. Topical steroids, which should be applied before emollients to lock in that topical corticosteroid, their effect, are the first line agents to prevent acute flares. The potency should be strong enough to control a flare quickly, and consideration should be given for tapering every other day and for maintenance therapy twice weekly, for example, weekends in the usual areas of involvement. Reversible side effects of steroid use include skin atrophy and telangiectasias. The other treatment modalities, in sensitive areas including the intertriginous areas of the axilla and groin, in addition to the face, they may require topical non-steroidal agents including calcineurin inhibitors such as tacrolimus and pimecrolimus. Newer non-steroid agents include crisaborole, which exerts its effect by blocking the PDE4. Pimecrolimus. These are the few studies I'm quoting to know the efficacy of the treatments. Pimecrolimus has been proven for efficacy and safety in long-term management of atopic dermatitis in children. This is a publication. In systemic therapy, when atopic dermatitis is not controlled with topical agents, systemic agents including phototherapy, both UVA and UVB, and also narrowband UVB, cyclosporin, azathioprine, mycophenolate mofetil, and methotrexate are used to decrease the flares. Cyclosporin. Cyclosporin has been approved for use in AD under the following condition: the child is above 16 years, and continuous treatment is only done if appropriate monitoring undertaken, and intermittent doses of up to 16 weeks are recommended in most patients. The dose should be titrated to lower renal toxicity. If hypertension develops in the child, in the patient, the dose should be reduced or discontinued. Cyclosporin, if an infection develops, reduce the dose of and manage the infection. All patients should be educated about symptoms of infection and when to seek the help. Patients need to be monitored for non-melanoma skin cancers also, and cyclosporin should not be used at the same time as phototherapy. We should monitor the serum lipid levels. This is a publication regarding the cyclosporin, the treatment of patients with atopic eczema, and 602 patients were undertaken the study, and the effectiveness of cyclosporin was similar in adults and children, but tolerability may be better in children when compared to adults. Azathioprine. Azathioprine, it is used in severe adult atopic dermatitis. This is a publication that it is useful. Methotrexate, azathioprine, and also mycophenolate mofetil, all these systemic agents are useful in the treatment of atopic dermatitis. Coming to the approach to therapy, basic moisturizers, then induction therapy with the help of topical corticosteroids, tacrolimus, and phototherapy. Maintenance therapy with help of topical corticosteroids and tacrolimus. Whereas in severe disease, we go for systemic corticosteroids or cyclosporin and then phototherapy. In adjunctive therapies, we have antihistamine and to avoid triggers and counseling, and oral or topical antibiotics, antivirals, and antifungals. The biologics. A newly FDA approved biological therapy is dupilumab, which is a monoclonal antibody that blocks the IL-4 receptor, and thus the effect of IL-4 and IL-13 is useful in the treatment of atopic dermatitis. There are two phase 3 trials of dupilumab in this publication, which are comparable. Dupilumab therapy was also associated with statistically significant improvement in other clinical endpoints, including reduction in the pruritus, symptoms of anxiety and depression, and improvement in the quality of life. The side effects more frequent with the dupilumab therapy groups than placebo included injection site reactions and conjunctivitis. Other modalities, recombinant interferon gamma therapy for atopic dermatitis. Interferon gamma is also useful in the treatment of severe atopic dermatitis. There were significant reductions in erythema, pruritus, and excoriations occurred in interferon gamma treated patients. The dose received recombinant interferon gamma of up to 50 micrograms per square meter of the area, and placebo also, with daily subcutaneous injections for 12 weeks. Newer drugs like topical phosphodiesterase inhibitors, the crisaborole. Crisaborole topical ointment was approved for mild to moderate atopic dermatitis. The drug is a phosphodiesterase inhibitor and shown to improve the skin symptoms. This is a publication regarding the efficacy of crisaborole. A decrease in pruritus occurred by day 8 in the crisaborole ointment group, and application site pain was most common adverse effect, and it was present in 4.4% of the crisaborole treated patients. And probiotics. There's a role of probiotics in the decrease of incidence of atopic dermatitis and also in decreasing the exacerbations. Bacterial products may enhance the immune system and prevent the development of allergic IgE antibody response. The probiotics are recommended during pregnancy and in breastfeeding women. Complementary therapies like bleach baths. What is a bleach bath? 0.5 cup of bleach in full of 40 gallons of tub 1 or 2 times a week to decrease the Staph aureus colonization. It helps to relieve the symptoms of atopic dermatitis by lowering the risk of superinfection with bacteria. The prognosis of atopic dermatitis. Overall, many patients with atopic dermatitis do improve with time. Patients with atopic dermatitis may also have allergic rhinitis and asthma. It has a childhood onset, persists for decades. The condition has relapses and remissions, and relapses often require the use of medications. Children continuously exposed to smoke, tobacco, pet dander, fumes, pollen, soap, detergent, and wool will have continual symptoms and overall quality of life is poor. The majority of patients with atopic dermatitis do improve with age. About 30% will develop the complications. Kaposi's varicilliform eruption that is linked to primary herpes infection. The vascular lesions appear in eczematous area and can quickly spread to the healthy skin. Treatment with acyclovir can prevent the lower the morbidity. Patients with atopic dermatitis are also prone to skin infections with staphylococcus and streptococcus. In patient education, the patient should wear cotton garments and avoid wool. Temperature in the home should be cooler side as it may help decrease the sweating and also itching. A humidifier is recommended to prevent drying of the skin. Foods that trigger atopic dermatitis symptoms should be avoided. And all the garments should be washed with mild detergents and with no fabric softeners or bleach. And when going outdoors, ample sunscreen and moisturizer should be applied. And the diary of all the foods should be maintained so that they can avoid the foods that trigger the attacks. Avoid the activities that cause excess diaphoresis, and patients who have asthma should be compliant with their medications and avoid allergens. Thank you so much.
My name is Dr. Sarika. I'm a ENT surgeon and allergy specialist, and for the last 18 years, I've been working on allergies. I now run a chain of clinics called Allergy Doc, and I have multiple centers in various parts of India. My aim is to reach out to more and more people across the country and help them treat their allergies, because most people believe that allergies can't be treated. So allergic rhinitis typically comes with excessive sneezing, blocked nose, watery nasal discharge, excessive itching in the nose, and sometimes may be accompanied by itchy, watery or red eyes. So when a patient comes to you with all of these symptoms, the diagnosis is allergic rhinitis, which is typically a IgE-mediated hypersensitivity reaction. And ARIA has divided allergic rhinitis. Earlier, we used to call it seasonal and perennial. But for the last 20 years, we're supposed to use this classification that says intermittent and persistent. It's a very simple classification. And I would request that everybody just in your diagnosis always write down IAR or PAR so that it just becomes a little more scientific. Intermittent allergic rhinitis is when the symptoms are less than 4 days a week or less than 4 weeks in a year, and persistent and when it is more than 4 days a week or more than 4 weeks in a year. Also, they are further classified into mild, moderate, and severe, depending on whether the sleep is disturbed or whether the normal activities are disturbed. So most of the time we have to ask the patient for a history. How did the thing start and what is the duration? If a patient comes with a short duration, then we don't need to do too many things and we can just start medicines. But most of the patients who come to me are patients who are chronic, who have been taking medicine for long periods of time. So we have to ask the patient a history that when they take medicine, are they better? And when they discontinue the medicine, do their symptoms come back? Also, the medication requirement, do they need to take a tablet once a week or once a day or twice a day? So that gives as a very quantitative idea of how much is the impact on their of the disease. And also we must ask them the impact on the quality of life, whether their sleep is disturbed, whether they are not able to go to work, whether they need to miss works and school days, whether they need to miss their school leisure or sports. So all of these give us an idea as to whether we need to intervene or not. A family history. When no parent is allergic, there is a 15% chance of the child to become allergic. If one parent is allergic, there's a 20 to 40% chance. And when two parents are allergic, almost 60 to 80% chance of developing allergies. So the family history is very important. And rhinitis, whenever a patient comes to us, you need to classify whether it is allergic or non-allergic. Non-allergic, we are not going to deal with it in this lecture today, because I'm going to just keep my lecture very limited to the allergic rhinitis. So the diagnosis always is with a detailed history. I take a 3-page history when we have to figure out what the history of allergies. And anti-rhinoscopy usually shows us pale turbinates and hypertrophied nasal mucosa. We must look for nasal polyps. Wherever you suspect that it is a polypoidal tissue, then we do a diagnostic nasal endoscopy. Diagnostic nasal endoscopy also helps us in identifying the size of the adenoids, but it is slightly difficult in children. But in bigger children, you can do the test. Chest auscultation is something, of course, all of you are doing it all the time. But for ENTs, most of us run around with an otoscope. But I advise all my ENT colleagues to always auscultate the chest, because as you know, almost 80% of patients with allergic rhinitis asthma develop allergic rhinitis, and almost 20% of patients with allergic rhinitis have an undiagnosed asthma. So it's always good to look for a wheeze in any patient with a sneeze. So the basic blood count, eosinophil count and absolute eosinophil count give us a very good idea. And if there is a eosinophilia, you should give them a 3-week course of Hetrazan with deworming and antihistamines to control that, because that cough gets controlled with that. Allergy test by skin prick method is the investigation of choice. I'll be speaking to you more in detail about this. Serum IG can be an indicator, especially when the values are in thousands. But a normal IG, normal total serum IG does not preclude allergies. And so many times we see patients with IG less than 100 still have a positive skin prick test and a lot of symptoms. So serum IG cannot be used as a diagnostic indicator. Serum specific IG can be used in patients who cannot undergo a skin prick test, if they have dermatographism, if they are unable to leave their antihistamine even for 48 hours, then a serum specific IG. But just a word of caution, a lot of us must have seen that blood tests, the screening test for 1500, 2000, 3000 rupees are there in the market, and they are almost flooding the market. I would request you to please refrain from doing these tests, because they don't help the patient and they certainly don't help you. Their correlation of symptoms with those allergens is very less. So we find that there are a lot of false positives, and this test doesn't help anybody. If you want to do a serum specific IG, do a Fadiatop. And Fadiatop is an expensive test. A good test will cost you between 12 to 18,000 rupees. So that can be used. Doing these screening tests is fairly useless. In patients with polysensitization, we can do component testing if it's available. So coming to the effective treatment and management, first, of course, the overview. Environmental control wherever is feasible. Pharmacotherapy is our mainstay of treatment, especially in mild and intermittent patients. Immunotherapy is the only way that you can actually treat the disease. And patient education, of course, you have to spend a lot of time educating the parent as well as the child, so that they feel that yes, allergy can be treated and they can lead a normal life, instead of feeling very disheartened, because many places doctors are still saying Allah ki marzi hai, apne se aayegi, apne se jayegi. But in 2020, doctors of evidence-based medicine cannot be speaking like that. We know very well that allergy can be controlled to a very large extent. So medical management, intranasal corticosteroids are the drug of choice. And I know that a lot of patients are resistant to taking nasal sprays and they prefer to take a tablet, but always tell them that the nasal sprays are safe. Even though they are steroids, they don't get absorbed in your body. They act locally in the nose. They're very safe. They impact all the features of allergic rhinitis. And oral antihistamines can be added as an add-on. And in patients with the hyperreactive airway disease, or when the lower airway is involved, you can add leukotriene receptor antagonists. But you must be very careful that you don't give it for a long period of time. Recommended dosage is 4 to 6 weeks. And there are neuropsychiatric side effects to this, especially in children. So if anybody is using Montelukast for long periods of time, I request you to please shift them to a single antihistamine. And of course, the final word on allergy treatment is allergen immunotherapy. I'll just be speaking to you about all of these. So intranasal corticosteroids are the drug of choice for allergic rhinitis and nasal polyps. They are safe for a long-term usage. They do not cause dependence. They have very little systemic absorption. And they improve the overall symptoms of allergic rhinitis. Oral antihistamines are the mainstay for mild allergic rhinitis or in combination with intranasal corticosteroids. Multiple antihistamines are available depending on your preference and the patient's pocket. You can choose the least sedative option. Fexofenadine is a very good molecule. Loratadine is something that I use for a long time. Bilastine I've been using for the last 1.5 years with excellent results. I prefer not to use sedative ones, especially because the population that I cater to is a working population and they don't want to be sleepy the next morning. So in pregnancy, we have used loratadine safely and cetirizine can be used. Intranasal antihistamines, especially if there's the nasal spray is just a pure antihistamine, that works much better. It is effective in relieving the sneezing and nasal itching very quickly. They act within minutes. Alone, they can be given up to 4 times a day, especially in acute allergic rhinitis. In combination with intranasal corticosteroid, they can be used for long term, but I prefer to use both the medicines separately instead of in combination. But the only thing is they have a very bitter aftertaste. Now, Azilastin, a lot of companies have come down with a better taste of Azilastin, but I still do not use it in children because mometasone works much better in children because it has a pleasant aftertaste. But I request all of you to please show the patient, spend about 10 seconds and show the patient how to take the spray. It's very simple. Shake the spray, bend forward, keep your mouth open and breathe through your mouth. Put one puff here facing the eye and one puff here, and tell the patient not to sniff in. They should not sniff it in because then it goes into the nasopharynx and it doesn't serve any purpose. So they should bend forward, take the spray, one puff here, continue to breathe, bend forward, breathe through the mouth. Couple of minutes later, any excess medicine can be cleaned with the tissue. That is the way that we must take the sprays, both the intranasal corticosteroids and the intranasal antihistamines. Leukotriene receptor antagonists are very effective as a step-up therapy, but we must remember to step down, and they are especially used when the lower airway is involved, more your domain than mine. But the dosage, like I said, should not exceed more than 6 weeks because of other unpleasant effects in children, including suicidal tendencies. So, and sometimes in my patients, I have seen a combination with the levocetirizine has a lot of withdrawal symptoms, especially in patients with urticaria. So you just use this with a bit of caution. So if the patient symptoms don't get better, we can add oral decongestants, we can have local decongestants, but always with a word of caution. Never give oxymetazoline, xylometazoline for more than 5 days. Please put it in writing. I know that radio and TV ads continue, but sometime when I can, I will put a PIL asking the companies not to advertise this as an immediate relief, because you get a lot of rhinitis medicamentosa when you stop taking local decongestants. So this always used with caution and just as an SOS medicine. Jalneti and can definitely help all the patients. Steam inhalation is very useful. Cromolones can be added, especially in non-allergic rhinitis. And ipotropia as an intranasal anticholinergic has also been tried more in non-allergic rhinitis. And capsaicin spray, I do not have much of an experience, but some people do use this, especially in gustatory rhinitis. So oral steroids should be used only in patients who are not responding to medical management, who have very severe symptoms, not routinely, and not for more than 5 to 7 days. So I request all of you to refrain from writing oral steroids regularly as a routine. So this is the way that we have to do. First, you add a antihistamine if it is mild symptoms, add a nasal corticosteroid. You can add leukotriene receptor antagonists, add up. You can add douching and avoiding the triggers and step up the therapy. Finally, you can add immunotherapy, and then you step down the treatment as the patients get better. So most of my patients, I teach them what to do, and so that they don't have to come to me every time, and they're able to do it themselves. Various kinds of allergy tests are available, and the choice is between a skin prick test and a blood serum specific IgE. The blood test is more accurate because it measures the IgE bound to the mast cell compared to the floating IgE measured in the in vitro test. Skin prick testing is safe, quick, reliable, painless, repeatable, visible to the patient, and far more economical than a properly done blood test. So it is the gold standard of allergic testing by the World Allergy Organization and all the European and American academies, and it is a blood test should only be kept as a backup tool. This is how we do the skin prick test in small children below 5. We just test for histamine, saline, and the dust mites, and this is how we apply the medicine. Slight prick is made. There is no blood should come out. Then you take the reading in 15 minutes, where you measure the induration, always in millimeters. So once you've done the test, the outcome includes allergen avoidance, medical management, and immunotherapy. The WHO position paper is that allergen avoidance and immunotherapy are the only treatments that modify the course of an allergic disease, and all others only provide symptomatic relief. I've been using subcutaneous immunotherapy for several years, more than 18 years now. And the intensive phase is twice a week injections, and the patient has to come to me for the first dose. Then we give them the injection, and then we hand over the medicine to the patient, and they can go to their local nursing home and take the injections twice a week. If the patient has good response, we put them on a maintenance. That's one injection a month. Sublingual immunotherapy was FDA approved in 2015, and now we've been using it. And monotherapy has to be given, and twice a week. This is much safer, very convenient to use, painless. The patient can take it themselves. So I find this very, very good and very effective as well, and it is safe. So I've trained in Bombay, and I've been working for 17 years on allergies, and I have a very good response with patients. And in allergic rhinitis, more than 90% patients do well, and they have they stop sneezing. There's a good improvement in the quality of life. The snort scores improve, and allergic pharyngitis also improves significantly. So my only take-home message for today is that allergy is treatable, and if anyone comes to you with an allergy, please give them the option to get their allergy treated, and so that they can bless you for a better life. Thank you very much.
Very good evening to everyone. Welcome to this online innovative allergic mass symposium, which is bringing together the 4 different specialities. And let me thank the Chess Council of India for giving me this opportunity. My task is to bring focus the ophthalmic allergic responses. As we all know that ocular surfaces, they exhibit a wide variety of immunological responses resulting in the inflammation of the conjunctiva as well as cornea. Let us begin with the allergic conjunctivitis. As we all know that outermost layer of eye is the conjunctiva. It can be divided into 2 parts, the bulbar conjunctiva as well as the palpebral conjunctiva. So let's see what are the ocular allergies. The allergic conjunctivitis is a broad group of allergic conditions which is involving the inflammation of the conjunctiva. Milder forms, they doesn't affect the cornea, but in severe forms, that can lead to the corneal involvement also, which could be a sight threatening. Here the pic is showing the normal conjunctiva, that is white in color. But here there's an inflamed conjunctiva which is occurring more on the peripheral part, less on the central part around the limbus. Whereas this pic shows a severe form of springkata where there's a heaping up of the conjunctiva is visible. And we'll go through it later on, one by one. So let us see what is the prevalence of allergic conjunctivitis. In Western world, it is almost around 20% of the population they get affected, whereas in India, 20 to 30% of the population suffers from this allergic disease. So to begin with, types of allergic conjunctivitis, it could be acute or chronic, and third variety is the GPC, that is giant papillary conjunctivitis. The seasonal allergic conjunctivitis, acute could be seasonal allergic conjunctivitis or perennial allergic conjunctivitis. Coming to the seasonal allergic conjunctivitis. This is a milder form of ocular allergy. It could be intermittent in nature, and generally it follows the exposure to the pollen grains, molds, and into the sensitive individuals. Commonly associated with the allergic rhinitis also. The typical symptoms are itching, watering, redness, and the edema of the conjunctival surfaces. Perennial allergic conjunctivitis. This is milder and persistent form, and it results from the continuous exposure of the persistent allergens such as house dust, mites, and animal dandruff. Less common and less severe form than acute conjunctivitis, seasonal acute conjunctivitis, and it is a primarily disease of young adults. And another form of conjunctivitis is the vernal conjunctivitis, that is occurring only generally in the spring season, and it is chronic seasonal allergic condition and intermittent and less frequently persistent also. Generally, it is seen in adolescent males between 8 to 12 years of age group. The signs and symptoms are ocular watering, itching, burning, foreign body sensation. Fun body sensation generally happens because of as it is shown in this picture, there is a giant papillae formation in the upper tarsal conjunctiva. This causes fun body sensation as well as it rubs the cornea and gives rise to the corneal erosion of the epithelium also and cause the inflammation also. So the patient will be having difficulty in opening of the eyes on awaking in the morning, and there is a stickiness also, and it resolves spontaneously and subsides with the age. Another variety is the atopic keratotic conjunctivitis, and this is a severe long-term disease which is associated with atopic dermatitis, which is a rare condition. Hypersensitivity to the allergens due to associated with asthma, rhinitis, dermatitis, and food allergens. The signs and symptoms are generally similar, like perpetual ocular itching, pain, burning, and heavy discharge. And impaired vision also. Once the cornea is involved, then there will be the impaired vision. And the chronic lid margin infection also occurs along with the chronic conjunctivitis that leads to eczema of the skin, of the eyelids, and the tear film abnormality also. And the corneal damage occurs due to recruitment and activation of the eosinophils. Because of the recruitment and activation of the eosinophils and release of other mediators, that also can cause the corneal damage. In this atopic keratotic conjunctivitis, only we see such type of symptoms. And coming to the giant papillary conjunctivitis. Giant papillary conjunctivitis is the causes of, this is due to the chronic mechanical irritation of the tarsal conjunctiva. There is a prolonged presence of fun body in the eye. Generally, it is seen in contact lens wearers. Those who are wearing contact lenses for more than 10 hours and repeatedly for around more than 5 years or so, they generally develop, as shown in this picture, the giant papillae over the upper tarsal plate. The symptoms are similar, like itching, irritation, discomfort, edema of the palpebral, conjunctival hyperemia, enlarged papillae seen in the superior tarsal plate. Now let us see what are the ocular allergens commonly. Grass fields, pollen grains, pollutants, especially in Delhi, there is a lot of pollution in winter season. Those dust particles will lead to the allergic conjunctivitis. Then animal pet dander, those who are keeping pets like dogs, cats, they generally kids play with them, and then this will lead to the such type of inflammation of the conjunctiva. Certain medications, mold growth, dust mites, these all the common causes for ocular allergens which leads to conjunctivitis, inflammation of the conjunctiva. Let us see the signs and symptoms of acute allergic conjunctivitis. Generally, there's itching, mucus discharge, conjunctival hyperemia, congestion, and then tearing, watering, and then eyelid swelling, as shown in this picture. Coming to the pathophysiology. Pathophysiology means exposed, once our eye is exposed to the sensitized allergens. These allergens, they adhere to the mast cells, and then this causes the degranulation of mast cells. And this degranulation will cause the release of histamine, which is the main culprit which causes the itching. And the other mediators which are released are prostaglandins, leukotrienes, cytokinins, and this causes the redness and swelling. And thus the patient will complain of itching, redness, watering, stringy ropey discharge, and photophobia. Coming to the management part. Management part minimizes the impact of allergic reaction on the individual's quality of life. So one most important thing is the avoidance of offending agents. Like if a person knows that they are allergic to certain particular type of dust or they are allergic to certain pollen grains, so they should not move out at that time. And if they are allergic to pets, they should not keep pets. Then the prevent or release of allergic mediators. At this step, any step we can stop the spreading of this disease. Then control of the allergic inflammatory cascade, and then prevent the ocular surface damage secondary to the allergic responses. Coming to the stepwise management of allergic conjunctivitis based on the level of the severity. Suppose if it is a milder form, then we can do it, treat it with the non-pharmacologically, like avoidance of contact with the certain irritant substances, like they should stop using contact lenses for a few days, and certain drops and certain preservatives which are added to the drops can cause to this. So they have to stop all these things. Then second thing is they should regularly clean their eyes with the water and then put ice packs also. These are the non-pharmacological management. Coming to the pharmacological management, for the congestion, we should start giving them vasoconstrictors. Then for itching, antihistaminic, topical or systemic, depending upon the severity. Then the mast cell stabilizers, dual-acting agents, the multiple molecules. Then non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs can also be given, and then the topical steroids. In severe cases, we can give, and still in steroid-resistant cases, we can go for immunomodulators like cyclosporine and tacrolimus, and surgery may also be required. Like coming to pharmacological management, how we have, once the conjunctivitis happen, then how to treat. The intermittent form and persistent form. If it is intermittent, mild, then we should give them ocular lubricants and the cold compresses and the topical antihistaminics or mast cell stabilizers. Then review the patient for after 4 weeks. If there is no symptom, then you can stop all this thing. And if there is a control, if there is no control, then we have to step up to mild, moderate to severe variety. So in moderate to severe variety, we can add the dual acting agents and then review for 4 weeks. If there is control, then maintain that for similar 4 weeks. And if it is no control, then step up to the severe and persistent variety. In the last variety, we have to add topical steroids and dual acting agents and review after 2 weeks. If there is control, then reduce the tapering doses of the steroids. If there is no control, then we have to check whether our diagnosis is correct or not. If it is a conjunctivitis or something else added to it, then rest all we know non-pharmacological preventive measures also we have to take care. Coming to the management part, the antihistaminics, how it works? It works by blocking the histamine receptors on the nerve endings and blood vessel walls. When it blocks the nerve endings, it alleviates the itching part, and when it blocks the blood vessels, then it reduces the ecchymosis and edema. Coming to the next one is the mast cell stabilizers. The mast cell stabilizers are used as a prophylactic agents for prevention of allergy rather than treatment. The sodium chromoglycate, lodoxamide, nedocromil, these are the drugs which are used. The role of action is it avoids the degranulation of the mast cells by preventing a critical calcium intake step that naturally follows the antigen antibody binding. And it elevates the allergic symptoms in long-term cases, not effective in stopping the immediate itching. So these are used for prevention, maintenance dose. Next is the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. These are safer for long-term use. It blocks the cyclooxygenase pathways, preventing the formation of certain inflammatory mediators. Like example is a ketorolac, diclofenac, flurbiprofen. However, no effect on histamine. So its alone use is limited. Then coming to the steroid part, generally it is used to treat the moderate to severe form of allergic reactions. Especially example is loteprednol. This is the milder form of steroid which should be used in the ocular allergies rather than using the dexamethasone prednisolone. As we all should be aware of this complication side effect of the steroid is it can cause cataract, glaucoma and other problems in long-term use. So we should use the milder form. Its action is blocking the mast cell phospholipase enzyme. Thus, it blocks the production of inflammatory mediators. The role is inhibits the all type of inflammatory mediators. It inhibits the histamine production also by blocking the histamine decarboxylase. It inactivates available histamine by increasing histaminases and decreases the capillary permeability. So we should use the steroid judiciously. Dual-acting agents like antihistamine, mast cell stabilizer, both. They have the properties of both mast cell stabilizer as well as antihistaminic. For example, olopatadine, epinastine, elkeftadine, bepotast. The role is it blocks the action of the histamine by blocking the histamine receptors, as well as it prevents the mast cell degranulation and thus prevents the release of mediators. Coming to the immunomodulators, the role of immunomodulators in ocular allergies. Used for treating the severe forms of steroid-resistant cases of chronic ocular allergies. And if steroids are unsafe, then also we can use the immunomodulators. They are cyclosporine A as well as tacrolimus. Its role is it inhibits the calcineurin, thus inhibits the T cell activation. It inhibits the release of preformed mediators from mast cells. It inhibits the histamine release also, but it should be used as a last line of treatment mode. So, coming to conclude, how allergic conjunctivitis has to be treated. In mild to moderate cases, we should use antihistaminics, dual-acting agents, and mast cell stabilizers. In severe cases, anti-allergics and steroids. In resistant cases, we can go for immunomodulators. In allergic rhinoconjunctivitis, antihistaminics and nasal spray and oral spray can be used. Oral systemic drugs can be used. And the dual-acting agents should also be added in allergic rhinoconjunctivitis. In GPC, giant papillary conjunctivitis, milder cases, we have to tell them to stop continuing use of contact lenses and make changes in the contact lens regime. Like if they have to use it, then reduce the time using the contact lenses. Like if they are using for 8 to 10 hours, then you should use for 1 to 2 hours, 2 to 4 hours, like that only. Then take a break and then again use it. Then severe form, mast cell stabilizers, steroids, and stop the use of contact lenses and wear glasses. In vernal keratoconjunctivitis, what should be the treatment modality? In milder cases, dual-acting agent should be added along with the mast cell stabilizers and steroids, milder dose. In moderate to severe cases, the mast cell stabilizers, steroids, dual-acting agents, as well as topical cyclosporine has to be added. In atopic keratoconjunctivitis, milder cases, anti-allergics, and oral histaminics. Moderate to severe cases, topical steroids or immunomodulators should be added. The mainstay of allergic management is antihistaminic, dual-acting anti-allergic agents, and mast cell stabilizers. Then next is the rational dual-acting agents. Antihistaminics can halt the most immediate symptoms of allergy. Mast cell stabilizers give from allergic symptoms in the long term. And then thus combination agents come into the effect, immediately relieving the ocular itching as well as the long-term symptoms of ocular allergy. Example, epinastine, olopatadine, bepotastine, elkeftadine. These should be used judiciously. Thank you everyone for the patient listening. Thank you.
Hello everyone, this is Dr. Kumar Utsav, and I thank you Chess Council of India to giving me this opportunity, to all those who are involved in giving me this opportunity. I am Dr. Kumar Utsav. I am from Varanasi, the city of the Prime Minister of India, and I am going to talk about allergic asthma. So what is the definition of asthma? We have already heard about other other forms of allergy. Now I'm going to talk about asthma, which is a heterogeneous disease usually characterized by chronic airway inflammation. It is defined by a history of respiratory symptoms such as wheeze, shortness of breath, chest tightness, and cough that vary over time and in intensity together with variable expiratory airflow limitation. What is allergic asthma? It is the most easily recognized asthma phenotype, which often commences in childhood and is associated with past and or family history of allergic diseases such as eczema, allergic rhinitis, or food and or drug allergy. Examination of induced sputum in allergic asthma goes on to show the eosinophilic airway inflammation. There are sputum eosinophils seen. patient with asthma phenotype, allergic asthma phenotype usually responds well to inhaled corticosteroid treatment. But we have to understand when it is not asthma. A patient coming to your OPD with isolated complaint of cough and no other respiratory symptoms, doubt your diagnosis of asthma. When there is a chronic production of sputum, it can be due to bronchiectasis also or tuberculosis also, doubt your diagnosis of asthma. Shortness of breath associated with dizziness, lightheadedness or peripheral tingling, it is a sign of psychosomatic disorder, paresthesia, doubt your diagnosis of asthma. When there is chest pain involved, doubt your diagnosis of asthma. Exercise-induced dyspnea with noisy respiration, doubt your diagnosis of asthma. One of the most interesting points is hygiene hypothesis. So what exactly is hygiene hypothesis? It proposes that childhood exposure to germs and certain infections help the immune system to develop. This teaches the body to differentiate harmless substances from harmful substances that trigger asthma. In theory, exposure to certain germs teaches the immune system not to overreact. So is it God's justice? Indeed it seems. The privileged class, the Western class, those who have access to antibiotics, vaccination, allergen sensitization. So all these people, they develop more, like in the Western world, they develop more allergies, asthma and eczema. Those of poor hygiene involvement in the poor classes, they have earlier childhood exposure. They have older siblings who are constantly exposed. There are daycare exposure, farming environmental exposure, early exposure to dogs and cats. So they have this protective response and are healthy and do not have that much asthma as compared to these Western children. That is what is God's justice. Now coming to atomic march. The atomic march was first talked in JCI's journal in the year of 2017 about development of atopic dermatitis in infancy and subsequent development of allergic rhinitis in asthma in later childhood. That is known as atopic march. It's a new terminology relatively, and people have not ever heard of it. It describes how infants with eczema, also known as atopic dermatitis, are more likely to develop hay fever, asthma and other allergic diseases compared to infants without eczema. In predicting the atopic march, results from the child study done in Canada, the researchers found that combination of conditions that can vary, that can have strong interactive effects of on the risk of asthma and allergy by the time the child turns 3. With further research, we can predict that these children, these infants who has developed dermatitis and allergy right now at the age of 1 is going to develop food allergy or asthma or allergic rhinitis in the future, and that way we are going to treat those patients early and effectively. So let's talk about atopic march further. The effects of interaction are shown in the following ways in asthma, suggesting the congener of all these diseases together. Infants with both eczema and allergic sensitization are at 7 times more risk of developing asthma symptoms by the time they turn 3. In infants with eczema only and no allergic sensitization are not at increased risk of asthma. Infants with eczema and allergic sensitization are 12 times more risk of developing allergic rhinitis compared to children without either condition. Presence of both eczema and allergy sensitization in infancy also greatly increase the risk of developing food allergy by the age of 3. When infants with eczema and allergic sensitization at 1 year are high risk of developing eczema at 3 years of age. So what did we understand from this atopic march? We understood that combination of these conditions can have a strong interactive effect on the risk of asthma and allergy by the time the child turns 3. If you have an early development of allergy like dermatitis, eczema and some allergen sensitization, then you are at high risk of developing rhinitis, high risk of developing rhinitis, high risk of developing asthma, and high risk of developing food allergy if the eczema and allergic sensitization is present at the early age. That is what is atopic march. Coming to the diagnosis of asthma. Now we are going to talk about allergic asthma. What is the diagnosis of your asthma? You are going to talk about cough. Symptomatology includes cough, shortness of breath, wheeze, which is mainly expiratory, chest tightness. So these are the four main symptoms, right? And usually a patient presents with combination of symptoms. Very less likely a patient presents either one of them. So nocturnal and early morning symptoms are more and are far worse than the daytime symptoms, associated at times with rhinitis, eczema, and conjunctivitis. Symptoms are triggered by factors such as exercise, allergen or irritant exposure, change of weather, or viral respiratory infection. Symptoms vary over time and in intensity. So chest X-ray are usually normal. Pulmonary function testing suggests FEV1 is reduced and confirm that with FEV1 by FVC is reduced. There is a positive bronchodilator reversibility test which is suggesting that FEV1 increase is more than 12% and more than 200 ml from baseline. Excessive variability in twice daily PF over 2 weeks. Significant increase in lung function after 4 weeks of anti-inflammatory treatment. Positive exercise challenge test of FEV1 fall by 10% and positive bronchial challenge test of FEV1 fall by more than 20%. What is the role of family history? Family history is actually very significant in allergic asthma because history becomes significantly more important in these cases. What is the role of FeNO? FeNO is modestly associated with levels of sputum and blood eosinophils. FeNO is elevated in asthma related to type 2 airway inflammation, also in eosinophilic bronchitis, atopy, allergic rhinitis, and eczema, and is not elevated in neutrophilic asthma. FeNO is generally lower in smokers and during bronchoconstriction in early phase of allergic response. So this is asthma management cycle. This is the most, I feel that this cycle is not so much talked about. So we're going to talk about this cycle a bit. Start with assess. First, when a patient comes to your OPD, assess the patient. Confirm your doubts. Confirm your diagnosis. Go for symptom control in these patients and go for treating the modifiable risk factors. Treat the comorbidities like rhinitis, GERD, obesity, anxiety. You have to treat these comorbidities. Recheck the inhaler technique and inform the patient about adherence. Make him understand why his disease treatment is important and why he should adhere to the treatment you have prescribed to him. And it should not be your corporate tie-ups which guide your treatment. It should be the patient's preference and his attitude towards life which should guide your treatment towards him. Then adjust your treatment according to the modifiable risk factors and comorbidities. Also involve the non-pharmacological strategies. Step up and step down the asthma medications, and education and skill training of patient is very important. Then review the response you have already given to the review the response by the treatment you have given to the patient and the counseling you have done. Check the symptoms. Go for checking the exacerbation history. Treat the side effects. Go for the pulmonary function testing in the follow-up visits. Most importantly, emphasize on the patient and parent satisfaction of the patient. Then again, begin the asthma management cycle. So what is mild, moderate, severe? We have often seen this chart, but what exactly is mild, moderate, severe? Mild asthma is one which is well controlled with step 1 and step 2 of treatment. Moderate asthma is one which is well controlled by step 3 of treatment. And severe asthma is one which requires step 4 and step 5 to prevent it from becoming an uncontrolled or uncontrolled asthma, or that remains uncontrolled asthma despite this treatment. So coming to this chart, step 1 and step 2 form the part of mild asthma, step 3 forms the part of moderate asthma, and step 4 and 5 form the part of severe asthma. What is step 1? We have seen this multiple times, but what exactly is step 1? When the symptom score is less than twice a month and there is no risk of exacerbation, no risk factors for exacerbation. Symptoms less than twice a month and no risk of exacerbation, right? No risk of exacerbation. So in this case, the new guidelines, the 2019 guidelines have changed from the continuous low dose ICS to as needed low dose ICS formoterol combination. What is step 2? Step 2 are symptoms which are more than twice a month but less than daily symptoms. So daily you can go for daily low dose ICS or as needed ICS formoterol. Step 3 is patient having troublesome asthma symptoms most days and waking up due to asthma at least once a week or more. Here you have to be smart and apply the SMART therapy. Give a low dose ICS LABA as a maintenance of daily dose, and the same inhaler has to be retaken. That is single maintenance and reliever therapy. That is SMART therapy. LABA as maintenance and reliever therapy in the patients. Or you can give maintenance only ICS and LABA with as needed SABA. Medium dose ICS with as needed SABA can also be given. Step 4, that is initial asthma presentation is coming in a severe exacerbation, acute exacerbation. In this patient, start regular controller treatment with high dose ICS or a medium dose ICS and LABA. A short course of oral corticosteroids may be needed to control the acute exacerbation event. Step 5 is uncontrolled or severe asthma. Here you have to do phenotypic assessment and consideration of add-on treatment. So once you label a patient as severe asthma, that is patient is a case of severe asthma, not managed by low dose ICS LABA or moderate dose ICS LABA. Here you have to check your inhaler technique. How do you label? Before labeling a patient of severe asthma or uncontrolled asthma, first check your inhaler technique. Discuss the adherence and barriers to use for the patient. Reconfirm whether you are going in the correct direction. Is it asthma or is it something else? Remove potential risk factors like smoking, beta blockers, NSAIDs, occupational or domestic allergen exposure. Assess and manage the comorbidities like rhinitis, obesity, GERD, OSA, depression and anxiety. Consider treatment step up. Refer to a specialist or severe asthma clinic. What add-on can you give? Like we had talked about add-on treatment in step 5. That is combined high dose ICS LABA, add-on tiotropium, add-on azithromycin or alternate day in a week, and add-on omalizumab, mepolizumab and anti-IL4R, sputum guided treatment, bronchial thermoplasty, add low dose corticosteroids in non-affording patients. What is step up and step down? So a patient having persistent symptoms and exacerbations despite low dose ICS, check for common problems like technique, adherence, persistent exposure and comorbidities. And if you have ruled out everything else, then step up the treatment. Move from step 2 to step 3, step 3 to step 4 or step 4 to step 5. What is stepping down? Once you have achieved a good asthma control and maintained same for 3 months, consider the lowest possible treatment that controls both symptoms and exacerbation. Do provide a written asthma action plan to this patient, monitor closely and schedule a follow-up visit, but do not completely withdraw ICS once you are stepping down. Understand this. So stepping down is decreasing the treatment and maintaining on the lowest possible treatment on once that controls both symptoms and exacerbation in this patient. So again, coming to this slide, what did we learn from this slide? Step 1 is patient having symptoms less than twice a month. So why do you wish to give him a daily inhaler? I don't think so. A treatment should be taken as much as only necessary. So step 1 is symptoms less than twice a month. So this patient will require as needed low dose ICS LABA combination or ICS formoterol combination. Patient having symptoms more than twice a month but less than daily, go for a as needed ICS LABA combination. Step 3 is patient having symptoms most days and waking up at least once a week due to asthma. So these patients require low dose ICS LABA combination almost daily basis. Step 4 and step 5 are patient having most days symptoms on most days and waking up with asthma once a week or more or low lung function. These are the steps. Thank you from my side. This is Dr. Kumar Utsav. Thank you CCI for giving me this opportunity. Thank you Dr. Swarnakar for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, thank you everyone for listening to me patiently. Hello everyone, this is Dr. Kumar Utsav.
So thank you, speakers, for actually a brilliant of course, review of the subject. We saw Dr. Nazia, Dr. Sarika, Dr. Ashna, Dr. Utsav. They actually dwelt with how this allergic march affecting a child starts from skin and of course progresses to itchy nose, which of course causes episodic allergic also conjunctivitis and may ultimately culminate into developing allergic bronchial asthma. I, of course, again welcome you all again in this panel discussion, and I also request you to be actually brief in answering the questions to the point, and anyone can, of course, chip in to give his or her comments. We've got barrage of questions which I could see in the question panel, so we'll have some questions from audience, and we'll go further. So first question is to you, I think, Dr. Sarika, and most of the questions which I am seeing in the question panels are basically to you. So first of all, a question from our side is that is of sensitization to an allergen, it is actually synonymous with being allergic to that allergen. If you can explain this concept, that if there is, of course, a sensitization, does it mean that the patient is allergic to that, or if you have to confirm by some other also clinical symptoms? Dr. Sarika.
That's a very nice question, Dr. Sab. The important thing is for us to do a skin prick test. And remember that we are not treating the skin prick test. We are treating the patient. So we must correlate the patient's symptoms with their history. Suppose the patient gives a history, he or she is allergic to 7 things, couple of dust mites and a few pollen. But if their symptoms are classical of an intermittent allergic rhinitis, that means they have a problem only in September, October, and February, March, then we must correlate with the skin prick test, and we consider the allergens. All of them are sensitizations. The allergy is only to what correlates with the patient's symptoms. So that is the key in treating, and many people fail in immunotherapy only because their correlation is not correct and they start treating everything. We don't need to treat everything. We need to treat only what the patient is allergic to.
Yeah, so it's quite important to also correlate this sensitization with allergic symptoms to have this immunotherapy effective. That is most important, and the hallmark of how your therapy is going to work. And is there also in your relationship with atopic dermatitis and also food allergy, Dr. Nazia? Because we get these questions actually very often in our allergic asthma patients. They would always ask, what is to be avoided, what's not to be done, and it's very intriguing to answer these questions if you tell them that, okay, don't eat this and that. So does it have some of the correlation, and what are its symptoms, in fact, of the food allergy? Does it start with oral and then all those problems, or then do they have some other problems? And I would again come back to Sarika for this question to you also.
Yeah. Atopic dermatitis has a genetic predilection also, and also it has food. Food has been proven in more than 60% of the patients. Usually it can start as young as 2 months of age, and food is proven even in breastfeeding also. The diet of the mother can also affect the atopic dermatitis of the baby, and also in the infancy, the dietary habits of the children, like will definitely affect the atopic dermatitis. So what to avoid, we have to basically they have to maintain a food diary. If the sensitization is done early, the patient might not be sensitive for the food, and if it's done in the later life, some children develop allergy for certain foods. Most of the culprit foods are soy foods, wheat, seafoods like fish and prawns and all these, and also sometimes egg, and also milk and milk products. So every patient has their own set of allergic foods, so they have to maintain a food diary so that they can avoid those foods, or they can reintroduce in their diet with a diet challenge gradually, so that they can get used to that.
And Sarika, what are your findings? Does your patient also ask about this, because this is the most commonly asked actually question? And what about this correlation of this food allergy in adults? It's of course there for children, but do you feel that this is also a factor for adults, that you have to look for food allergy? And do you just see it very common? And how do you answer this question to your patients?
Usually, I don't do a blanket, don't eat this, don't eat that, because most patients, especially the allergic rhinitis and sinusitis patients in India, they think that rice, curd, and milk, they are, because they are white in color and they are little mucousy and phlegmy, so they always assume that I mean, they'll themselves say, "ये तो हम खाते ही नहीं है."
खाते नहीं,
My
correct.
standard line is that you don't have to avoid any food unless you think it is not suiting you. Suppose you find that every time you eat a orange or every time you eat a banana, then you develop a sore throat or you develop an episode of allergic rhinitis, then you have to avoid it. But blanket ban on foods is not recommended, and I certainly don't do it. In food and the skin prick testing, what I have seen from my experience over the last several years is that food allergens are more important for skin allergies. For urticaria and atopy, when you come positive to a certain food, then you tell the patient to eliminate it from their diet for 2 to 3 months and then reintroduce, like Dr. Nazia said, we reintroduce one food per week into the diet after a period of elimination. And that 4L food challenge sort of correlates the symptoms. If the patient is like, I have recently had a patient who was taking 3 Allegras a day,
Wow.
severe urticaria. He was allergic to 4 foods I told him to avoid. One of them was coffee. Then he told me on my face, I'm very unhappy to meet you, because he loves his coffee. But within 1 month, his wife called back and said he's now absolutely symptom free. So when you are able to identify and tell them to avoid, that makes a huge impact, especially for urticaria. I think Dr. Nazia will agree that in skin allergies, food have a very huge role.
What are the manifestation of this basically food allergy? I mean, do you have, I mean, rashes? It's not like that. It's basically oral, I think some oral, I mean, somewhat what this kind of symptoms, and some G also symptoms. So food allergy is not like you have, hives or allergy. I mean, do you also get so many patients like this? I mean, especially with seafood.
You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Or Dr.
I think
Nazia?
I'll go ahead with that.
yeah. Utsav.
So, sir, food allergy is basically the immune system reacting to certain kind of food. It's basically a case of mistaken identity, right? And your immune system misidentifies a food particle for an allergen and starts releasing Ig, and that excessive Ig release causes the symptoms of digestive problems like abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and some amount of diarrhea, hives, itching, eczema, sometimes swollen airways, tingling and itching in the mouth, swelling of lips and feet, and dizziness, sometimes lightheadedness. These are most common symptoms seen in the patients.
And so do you think that we're going to food fad, like, cold food, hot food, they won't eat also banana? And I had one patient who had not eaten rice since 3 years because he actually believed that this
so Sarika ma'am already explained that the blanket ban on any kind of food is not advisable. Patient has to identify the kind of food is allergic to by skin prick testing or by blood testing. Those are the two things which are maybe useful. Again, we have to go for the risk factors, like family history is the most important history probably for allergy, and other allergies history. Age of the patient is also very important, because food allergy is most common in young patients and not so common in the old patients. Asthma is a significant history, because most commonly food allergy is seen in patients of asthma itself. So complications of anaphylaxis, eczema, and atopic dermatitis is seen. Preventions, what we can do is early introduction of all kinds of food in a patient. And if you already know that a patient is allergic to something, you should avoid that kind of food. Or later you can, the correct diagnosis is most common way of diagnosing this is actually the history of the patient, history and family history of the patient. Everything else comes later. History of the patient and family history is the way you diagnose. In minor cases, you can go for antihistamines. In severe cases of swollen airways and patient having breathlessness and other severe symptoms, EpiPen or this subcutaneous epinephrine is being used, and a trip to emergency room is at times seen.
So I think the bottom line is, so I think the bottom line is that basically you should have your homework done. So basically We should ask
Yeah,
them
yeah,
to go and
definitely,
see.
definitely.
And then only end up. There is no need to blanket ban. People do say they don't eat
No,
fruit,
no, no.
banana, don't eat ice cream.
Nothing is possible in India,
Yeah, so
boss.
we always
Nothing
tell
is
them to go
possible.
back and see and just taste a little bit and see if it really does any problem. So that would be, I think, what the message for about this food allergy. And it is not seen basically in adults as often as you see in actually children. That's what my perception is.
Yeah,
Agree,
yeah.
Dr. Sarika?
No, sir, we see enough of it in adults. In fact, many people will say that I'm 30 years old, I've eaten everything till now. How come I have developed it now? So we
So
often have to tell them that sensitization happens over a period of time, depends on what you're exposed to. And gradually, one fine day, you may develop allergies even at the age of 30 or 35 or 40. Also, food allergies present differently in different people. So some, of course, are like classically they have vomiting or diarrhea. Then that is total intolerance, and often it is seen in celiac disease. Celiac
gluten.
disease is not a allergy, as you all know, but a lot of time patient present classically with bloating sensation and just abdominal fullness. And when you tell them identify what they're allergic to and eliminate it, that helps. And sometimes, of course, it is classical hives, atopy in children, angioedema, lip swelling. So it's not necessary that only a uvula will swell up if you're eating food. You may have sometimes just vesicles in the tips of your fingers. So food allergies I've seen present very differently, from very mild forms to even anaphylactic, like anaphylactoid reactions.
Yeah.
So it's the entire spectrum. Important thing is to sensitize people, especially in India, because the teachers and daycare, the people who care for the child. So a lot of times, when the child comes with a swollen lip, they'll think, "Arey, kuch insect kaat gaya." They're not even thinking of food allergies. Despite the fact that we know one 14-year-old boy had died recently, about 6-8 months back, because he has a cheese sandwich and he had milk allergies. So it is very important for all of us to be aware of food allergy, and all the caregivers, like in the West, all the caregivers are total knowledge about food allergies. Sensitizing the public to the risks of food allergies is, I think, a step forward in that direction.
Correct. And also, Dr. Nazir, do you have this chronic also spontaneous urticaria treatment? Can you just, because we do see such also patients. Do you think they are part of this allergic march, or they would just have something else? Because that is what is believed, that when they have urticaria and we just treat on this chronic spontaneous urticaria. What are your take on that?
Chronic spontaneous urticaria, basically when the urticaria persists for more than 6 weeks, we diagnose as chronic spontaneous urticaria, and after investigating, then we find that IgE levels are raised in this urticaria, this particular set of urticaria, that it has no other involvement when IgE is raised. So in such basically the treatment starts with antihistamines, and the dosing up of antihistamines according to the decreasing the lesions. It is any like non-sedative and sedative antihistamines like levocetirizine, updosing up to once daily to 4 times daily, and sometimes 6 times daily also. And we also treat with the help of steroids when we find along angioedema along with that. Basically, and the chronic spontaneous urticaria continues for 3 to 4 months, and according to the investigations and the need of the patient, we can treat the patient with the help of other drugs like methotrexate and cyclosporin. In children, basically cyclosporin is more useful and easy to be treated, and systemic steroids are used only when we find angioedema and life-threatening episodes in the acute episodes. And also we use of yes, sir?
Yeah, please go on.
Yeah. When the chronic spontaneous urticaria, when it's IgE raised and there is an atopic urticaria, we also use of omalizumab, biologicals like omalizumab, which is treated as a once a month course, like in 300 milligrams of subcutaneous doses.
Correct. So for biologicals are being used in CSU. That is one of the indications of omalizumab to use in this chronic chronic spontaneous urticaria. And I was coming to you, Archana. So we have got this acute allergic conjunctivitis. What is the treatment? And nowadays, people, for children, they are online and they are also seeing their screen time is very increased. Do you think? Yeah. And then how do you just actually distinguish between these? The fatigue eye and going for this acute allergic conjunctivitis? What is the treatment?
Yeah, nowadays because of the online classes, kids are exposed for many hours to view the screen continuously, and because of that there's a fatigue of the eye, and then they used to develop the dry eye also because of the continuous exposure and they don't blink also frequently because of constant staring. So that leads to dryness also. So generally we used to say the people that they should follow the rule of 20-20-20. That means every 20 minutes they have to take a 20-second break, and they should look for a distance of 20 feet also. If they have a window, they should look at the 20 feet distance, or and they should take a break, and they should massage their eyes and close their eyes and rotate in all the directions so that the eye get relaxed. Otherwise, constant continuous staring in the screen will lead to the fatigueness and dryness also. And coming to the allergic conjunctivitis, in acute cases, they should take care. Especially, they should not spread the disease to other family members also. For that, they should wear the dark goggles, and they should also take precautions for the washing things, like they should not share their cosmetics, this thing, what do you call?
Yeah. And what are the basic eye care that you can do for this allergic conjunctivitis? Do you have some basic eye care apart from antihistamine drops and that you use that you have told in a lecture? Do you have some basic eye care that of course they can adhere to?
Yeah, they should clean their eyes repeatedly, and they should not rub their eyes, and then they should take care of the cold compressions should also be used, so that the eyes will the congestion will reduce. And they should take rest also. If it is too red, then they should take rest for 1 day or 2, and they should avoid going to the public places, and then they should wear the dark glasses also. Generally, people think this acute conjunctivitis spreads by seeing one another person, but it is not like that. It is just because of the contact of the tear film. If it comes in contact with other person, then only. So they should keep their eye towels or whatever kerchiefs also, they should keep it separately. They should not share it with other family members too.
So I think we have seen role of biologicals in, I think, a bit of role in the chronic spontaneous urticaria. Dr. Utsav, can you tell them about the role of biologicals and allergic?
What are biologicals?
There, I mean, how much and affording cost and all those things.
So, what are biologicals? We have to make our crowd first. You know, biologicals are medications basically made from cells of living organisms, like a rat probably or something. That then these medications are modified to target specific molecules in the humans, right? For as the target molecules are antibodies, are cell receptors, are any other molecules, these biologicals then go on to act on these pathways and target these molecules, disrupt these pathways. This lead to fall in inflammation and cause and rebate the asthma or allergy symptoms. Basically, biologicals are used in, at least in respiratory, I can tell, are used in difficult to treat asthma, uncontrollable asthma, and severe asthma. Okay, benefits. What benefits do we attain from biologicals? Biologicals decrease the frequency of exacerbation, reduce asthma symptoms, improve lung function, improve quality of life. They reduce the requirement of dosage of controller medications also. Loss of missed school days, we can say that. These are the ways we move forward. And what biologicals are available in asthma: omalizumab, mepolizumab, benralizumab, reslizumab, and dupilumab. So these are available and approved for asthma, of which omalizumab is most commonly used. It's an anti-IgE molecule, targets the IgE antibodies. Then benralizumab, reslizumab, and mepolizumab are being used. They target the eosinophils and target the eosinophil pathway and decrease the inflammation that way. Dupilumab is basically targets two molecules in the allergic inflammation pathway. So yes, they are available and they are extremely useful, but then a cost factor is present. Cost of omalizumab have decreased drastically to 8,000 rupees per dosing, but still as of now 8,000 per dosing for an asthma patient is too much to ask for, at least in India. So a further decrease in cost will make them more useful, more available to general public. I think few of us are already using it. It has given some tremendous results. We have seen patients whom we have completely removed from any treatment of controller or reliever. This patient just comes once a month, takes the omalizumab, has been doing so for last 4 years. Tremendous results at time if the
Correct.
choice
But
of
only
patient
thing
is
is
correct.
they're quite costly availability. I think there are two
Yeah.
or three biologicals which are available, and we should really carefully choose them. We come to basically one question that is common to us: that how to just prevent this primary and also the secondary prevention to stop this allergic march. So once it has begun, do you have any ways and means? And if there are some primary, secondary preventions that you can spell out, I will start with Dr. Sarika and then Dr. Nazia.
First thing, of course, is avoidance, and the second is immunotherapy. They must both be initiated early, especially in younger patients, children in their teens and 20s. Those are the patients that I treat very aggressively and I treat early with immunotherapy. We put in all the avoidance measures, but we start preferably sublingual immunotherapy very early. And I have a series of 38 children below the age of 10 in which I have given sublingual immunotherapy for house dust mite, and all of them are off nebulizer now for several years. So I feel that early intervention is the key, and the sooner we do it, the better it is. If we are able to spread this awareness, especially among our pediatric colleagues, that will be very beneficial for children so that they don't go on to develop allergic rhinitis and especially asthma, because that is a disease that changes your lifestyle completely.
Dr. Nazia, I think the patient and also the child comes to you first with atopic dermatitis. So what do you say to them, how to really prevent their progress to allergic rhinitis and then eventually to allergic asthma if it can happen?
Yeah, the atopic children can present as young as 2 months of age, and when we find one or both the parents of atopic history, the parent should know that they should use ample of moisturizing lotions, because the stratum corneum, the barrier function of the skin, is very important in development of atopic dermatitis, and which further plays weight for the other allergic disorders like asthma. So lots of use of moisturizing creams, and also the hygiene hypothesis plays here also. In atopic dermatitis, and also introduction of probiotics and prebiotics in the diet of both the pregnant women and also in children will help in decreasing of atopic dermatitis. One of the treatment modalities nowadays is proven that probiotics treatment is decreasing the symptoms of atopic dermatitis, and also smoking to prevent smoking factors and other pollutions, and also woolen clothes to be avoided, and so that the sensitization is less, and this can decrease the occurrence of, and at least the infantile atopic dermatitis can be prevented and prolonged, and the children can, and cold temperatures, and we see more of the atopic children from Western countries where the temperatures are cold, and so these are the factors we should take care, and the patient should know even before the child develops, they should follow certain things that so that the baby does not develop atopic dermatitis.
Correct. So those are the kind of things that we can, of course, ask these patients once we diagnose them. Now I'm just taking this audience question panel, and there is a lot of interest in the skit and slit immunotherapy. So people have asked, is there any head-to-head of studies comparing this subcutaneous and sublingual immunotherapy? How do you choose your patients for the sublingual, whether to go for sublingual or for also subcutaneous immunotherapy? So if you can just go a little bit more on that, Dr. Sarika. Yeah, Sarika.
Yeah, there are studies about sublingual and subcutaneous immunotherapy, but all the results are equally good. And subcutaneous, both the therapies have their own advantages and disadvantages. For last 18 years, I have been using subcutaneous immunotherapy, but since 2015 December, when FDA approved sublingual immunotherapy, I've started using it with very good results for the last 5 years now. The advantage of sublingual immunotherapy is that it is very safe. There are no side effects per se. So that is one big thing of the thing. It is painless. So it can be given by the patient's family directly. They don't need to go to a doctor. So a doctor visit and that much amount of expenditure is not there. So it is very easy to use. You have a small box, you put it in the fridge, you put an alarm on your phone, and twice a week you take the drops. The course is for 1 year. And after the first, that is a build-up phase, then you give the maintenance, that is once a week dosage for the next 2 to 5 years. Ideally, I've seen 3 years of therapy is more than enough, and the effects of this last for 12 to 15 years later on. And subcutaneous immunotherapy, the advantage is that it builds up fast. So the course finishes in 6 months' time. And you can mix dust mite and pollen. Suppose there are two significant components. One is a persistent with a seasonal component. You can mix both of these in subcutaneous immunotherapy up to 5 allergens, not more than 4 to 5. But the disadvantage is that it is painful. It needs injections twice a week. The patient has to go to a doctor nearby. They have to sit there for half an hour. So that adds cost and money and time. There's a risk of anaphylaxis. The first dose, we are very careful to give it with all the emergency precautions. Having said that, we have a lot of, it's very, very safe medicine. There's, absolutely no mortality in the last several years. You just have to be very careful with it. But personally,
for what allergens they are available, I mean, this what called slit therapy. There is another question that what allergens you can treat with this sublingual, because this thing comes so very easy. You know, I mean, instead of a prick, you have to just basically so it's quite interesting to see the progress. So, do you have all the allergens available for immunotherapy, or there are certain allergens that we can treat?
So all the allergens available. We have dust mites, we have pollen, we have fungus. And we do not ideally do this for insects like cockroach, etc. A lot of times you'll find that in mosquito and cockroach come positive in a therapy. Please remember, you don't need to treat it. So sometimes you just tell them that aap all out laga lijiye, and if you have cockroaches at home, you use pest control. We don't really need to treat everything, but we have to be very sensible in what we are treating, because house dust mites are responsible for 55% of the allergies worldwide. That's a very significant component. Pollen, we must remember that we treat it only if it correlates with the patient's symptom history. And fungus, we keep it reserved for patients with AFRS, with recurrent nasal polyps, who's had a positive mucin or allergic mucin or fungal growth. Then they are the indications for doing a fungal immunotherapy. Food immunotherapy is actually under investigation. Yeah. And a couple of patients, I have tried it and it works, but it is still not FDA approved. So we specially tell them that this is under experimental basis. So it can be given for some patients, but very classic indications for sublingual immunotherapy for food.
And so, do you do the skin prick test, allergy test in your practice, and do you also practice immunotherapy?
I have people who
are going away from it. Only we used to find some older I think, generation of pulmonologists they used to do, and now I don't know what's the status. We have just started about 3 years back. We were not doing it till now, but of course, because of the pressure of the patient, they want to know which allergen, and then we have started. So, about your practice, Utsav, and then also pulmonologists do not do it. I mean, do you have any of whatever reason?
There is a deliberate, there is a deliberate resistance from pulmonologists towards skin prick testing. They think that is absolutely true, that there is a deliberate resistance from our side towards allergy testing, and there are patients coming to our OPD for this ki sir hame allergy ka test karana and everything like that.
What are the reasons for resistance among pulmonologists when of course patients are asking
this is psychological levels. It's a labor intensive job. We have to understand that allergy testing is a labor intensive job, and you cannot hand over a labor intensive job to an unintelligent staff of yours. It takes energy, it takes intelligence, it takes your time, and particularly in an OPD of 50 to 60 patients every day, I don't think it is physically possible for every single one of us to prick and do it for every single patient. Maybe if you are in a corporate, you are seeing 5 to 10 patient, 15 patient, it is possible to do that and have your DNB student to do that for you. But like for passing it on such an important job to an unintelligent 8,000, 10,000 rupees staff, I don't think that is worth it. I am totally in with what Dr. Sarika told, is that allergy testing and skin prick testing has to be a part of every pulmonology clinic. That is the way forward. We have to, it is like what every week we get at least 2 to 3 patients who want to get allergy tested, and we'll get it tested for sure. Many more patients will come forward if we provide these facilities at our setup. So that is the truth. We have to do it somewhere in the future, and have to give these options of immunotherapy to young patients who come to our OPDs. Definitely there is a role of immunotherapy, yes, and we have to adapt ourselves to the changes that are coming.
What about the challenges, Sarika? Because once you said that once immunotherapy is started, you have to give it for 3 years, 2 years, 6 months. So do you have challenges? How many of your patients, in fact, also complete this immunotherapy for 3 years? I mean, do you have any data on that? Because that's what I mean, we find the challenging thing. Or do you ask these patients to take that at their home or at their this thing? They don't have to come to the clinic. What's the protocol for these
The
patients?
subcutaneous immunotherapy, I've seen that there is people don't want to continue, and also they get very good relief. So by the time they finish their course, their intensive phase, they're not totally symptom free. So then they think, okay, abhi to main theek hu, why should I take it? But there are many patients who we sensitize and we tell them that you have to. And sublingual immunotherapy, I find the compliance is much better because it is painless. And now more and more patients, but a lot of time we see that they've completed their 1 year, then they go away, and then 1 year later they come back and saying, जब तक दवाई लिया था उसका असर बहुत अच्छा था, अब मुझे वापस लेना है. So of course that is there. Also, in India.
Again, this is where Sarika ma'am, this is where patient thinks that he is being cheated. This is like really happens.
Yeah.
Some people in Varanasi give immunotherapy, and at the end of 3 years, the patient when stops immunotherapy, and after 6 months, patient again starts getting symptoms. He feels he's cheated by the doctor. So that is where somewhere we have to draw, and we have.
I think that we have to select our cases very carefully for immunotherapy.
Yeah.
I think that we should not give it to each and every patient. That's what I'm saying. That we should have, I think, a selection of patients who will really.
That is the most important point.
The wisdom is knowing when, intelligence is knowing when to do it, and wisdom is knowing when not to do it.
Yeah, definitely.
Patients
Who
who are
not
very
to do it?
symptomatic, who will bless you even if their symptoms come down by 50%. If the patient is mild symptomatic and they have intermittent problem, then don't waste your energy, don't waste their money. So patient selection is the key, and we must always keep their interest in mind. And like I tell my patients, I don't want you to come again and again. I want you to get better in one time so that my name will spread and you'll send me 10 more patients. That's always, we must work for the long run. And for doctors,
so it can lead to bad name as well as good name if suppose there is of course a success in this immunotherapy. So of course,
always we must keep the
selection of patient selection of patient is very important. And Dr. Nazia, do you also do this patch test for this thing? And then what are the indications? We do skin prick test, but of course you can't do it for atopic dermatitis. Do you have any role of this patch test that we do, and how does it also?
Patch test is done in contact allergic dermatitis, but not in atopic eczema and all. Patch test basically is to find out which allergen, contact allergen, the patient comes across. Like some people are allergic for some nickel and some balsam of Peru, and sometimes like PPT and all. So there is a set of a batch of allergens which are provided along with the stickers, and they are applied, and the contact sticker is applied, and we'll know that the patient is particularly allergic for that particular, so that they can avoid the hair dye or rubbers and plastics. But it's not done in atopic dermatitis.
So I'm just seeing questions from the this panel of questions, and there is one question that how long we can use this intranasal steroids. This we asked by Dr. Sunaina. So how long can we use intranasal steroids, Dr. Sarika? Once we have started, what are the ways and means to really taper it, or what we do?
Intranasal corticosteroids, especially fluticasone and mometasone, are very safe. There are studies that show even if you take it for 10 years at a row, they do not cause any side effects. Earlier on, we used to have crusting, nasal bleeding infections. But now with better dilutants and all of these symptoms have disappeared. The only indication for lifelong steroids is patients with nasal polyps, especially AFRS. Budesonide is the one drug that actually works very well with these, but budesonide has its own set of complications. It increases the intraocular pressures and can cause glaucoma. So budesonide is the one steroid that must be used with extreme caution. We use it post-operatively, but then after on we tell the patients to move to fluticasone, furoate or mometasone, which are definitely safer. But having said that, most patients have a resistance to taking steroids for long-term basis. And those are the patients who come to us asking for a long-term treatment. Except AFRS, that is the only indication where we want to give them prolonged steroids intranasally. But otherwise, most patients 4 to 6 weeks is what I recommend. And then we tell them to take it as needed, SOS basis, not on a daily basis.
Yeah. There's another question for you from Dr. Venugopal. Is there any role for surgery in the treatment of allergic rhinitis?
Surgery has only one role in allergic rhinitis, and that is to remove nasal obstruction. We must never tell the patient that their allergies will go away after doing the surgery. In fact, that is what causes a bad name to nasal and sinus surgeries. So, whenever I do a surgery like a FES or a septoplasty in an allergic patient, I always tell them we are treating the obstruction, but your allergy will still need treatment. It will come back. So submucous diathermy reduces the turbinate size. Nasal polyps will be removed by endoscopic sinus surgery. Gross deviation will will be done by septoplasty. But all of this surgery will give you a temporary relief, and it will treat the obstruction. Sneezing, watery rhinorrhea, pruritus will not go away with surgery. We must always tell the patient and give it to them in writing.
Correct. There's another question for you, Sarika, again for you, that what is the role of HPMC powder and peppermint powder, which is used as a, what he's saying? There's some brand name that he's using that.
Yeah, peppermint powder. Yeah,
HPMC
it
powder,
covers
powder,
the.
which you can use. They say that this is used as what a barrier of nasal mucosa, and then it can just prevent allergy by blocking these allergens adherence to the mucosa. So, I mean, do you use, because you're not, I've mentioned this, and
It is it goes by the name of Nazact. If I'm right, Nazact is the name.
Nazact, yeah, Nazact, correct. So his spelling was wrong. Yeah, it is.
Ethyl cellulose is what is used. Ethyl cellulose is the nasal spray that they use nasal. But I have not used it personally. I do know that they use it as a barrier obstruction, but I have not used it personally. None of these people have come and met me. I have not taken any trial of patients, so I cannot speak about it. I have no personal experience with Nazact.
Yeah, so I think we are exceeding our time, and I have got feelers from the organizers to wrap it up. Just one last, question to all of you: What is your take-home message about this allergic march? I'll actually begin with Sarika. What do you really want to, just tell the audience through this?
All my fellow doctors, I just want to tell you, if 20 to 30% of the citizens are suffering from allergies, we cannot brush it under the carpet. I request all of you to please train, whether you are from whichever field, please spend time, take a course, attend that course, start practicing prick testing and immunotherapy. It will be very rewarding to you for the simple reason that your patient gets better and they will bless you.
Utsav?
I think today's presentation was a huge success. I learned a lot of things.
Yes.
While speaking, I learned a lot of things from Sarika ma'am, Archana ma'am, Nazia ma'am, from you, sir. So learning is a continuous process. Do join us in the next event too of CCI, and thank you CCI and thank you Swarnakar sir for this excellent event. That would be from my side, and thank you to all you listeners. It is because of you we do this, and without you, everything else is meaningless.
Yes, Nazia?
I would, in this allergic march, I would emphasize the use of moisturizing lotions and moisturizers in children, because it's very important that if they are having, they should know the awareness of using a lot of moisturizers, so then they can prevent this atopic dermatitis, and we have a hope that we can prevent other more severe systemic diseases like asthma. So thank you all of you for giving me this.
And Archana, you are imparting also this message to all of you, to all of us. Archana?
Yeah. I just wanted to tell that those who are allergic to certain things like dust, mites, they should avoid such exposures, and they should take proper precautions, like especially for contact lens also, and other people, those who are doing studies, online lectures and all, they should also take precautions to take a break in between while reading, studying. And especially those who are suffering from allergic conjunctivitis and all, they should take special need precautions, and they should not share their things, purchase and all like that. And I would like to thank CCI to give me this opportunity, and thank you.
Thank you. So I hope that audience enjoyed this webinar as much as we did bringing this webinar to you. Thank you all. Thanks is due to also Dr. Nazia, Dr. Sarika, Archana and Utsav, who spared their valuable time for this educative also, and must telling us about the topic March. March of gratitude is towards this Chess Council of India for also giving us this platform where actually for the first time 4 different specialty conglomerated for a common, of course, topic leading to this superb deliberation, which also actually promoted this interspecialty bonhomie of sorts. And I really thanks the office bearers, Dr. Narendra, and also Dr. Ravi Doshi, Dr. Krishna, my friend, is always there behind us, and of course Dr. Narayan Pradeep. And I think a big thank you is due to our CIPLA Tech support team, Vipul, Vinod. And there's a greater gratitude to you also, viewers, who also logged in to join us for this webinar. I think that's all from us. Good night and stay safe, stay healthy, and also wishing you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year 2021. And of that will just bring us hope in this times of despair. Take a good care of yourself. See you all soon. See you and bye for now.
Thank you.
Okay, good night.
Night, sir.
Bye. Happy
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.